Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the evolution of data consumption. So in particular, I just want to say, this is one of the topics that's very, very dear to my heart. It's an area for us as a vendor of analytical tools that is something that we think about a lot. We think about how people use data to improve their organizational performance and how do we increase adoption of data consumption in organizations. How do we get more people using data to do their jobs well? And ultimately, the result of that is that we're very passionate about the whole idea of data consumption within organizations. So who am I? My name is Glen Rabie. I'm the CEO and the big fish of Yellowfin, and my history really quite simple. I started life as a data analyst. I worked on very big data warehouse projects, and for all of my working life, essentially, I've been using data, consuming data, building tools to analyze data and to present data to organizations. And ultimately, I am the quintessential data geek. I love the stuff. I love working with data. And as I said, I'm very, very excited about thinking and working with organizations to think about how we can improve data consumption models and understand how data is used in organizations so that every organization can be far more data-driven and build a data culture as a result. So why is data consumption critical? For me, this is a really interesting topic. As an industry, we spend a lot of time talking about data analysis. We talk about tools to analyze data better. We talk about predictive analysis. We talk about automated analysis. But there's very little conversation about the consumption of data. How is it that an organization actually uses data to make better decisions, to drive the organization forward, to improve performance at all levels of the organization? And I think it's time as an industry that we started to do that. We started to change the focus from a very small pool of people who analyze to the much bigger pool of people who consume. And when we look at the narrative and we think about what's happening, say, in chief data officer space and some of the conversations we have there, there's this real desire that every organization consumes data more effectively and is better at it. And so that's really why we want to talk about data consumption today. And there's three core drivers for that when we think about organization performance. We as leaders of organizations communicate with numbers. So, every piece of organization communication that I see internally, whether it be in our organization or from others, is fundamentally founded in numbers. We talk about our performance, our growth of our business, or the things that we need to do our business, where we need to improve performance, and we do that in the context of numbers. So we say, here are the growth targets we want to hit, here are the sales targets we want to hit. We want to reduce the incidence of this disease by X. We are fundamentally talking and communicate around numbers. We motivate people with numbers. It's particularly in the sales organization. Commissions are numbers driven. We want people to be driven by numbers. In the same way that organizations are driven by numbers. And this is, to me, is the heart of data consumption. And when we think about the problem of data consumption, we really are addressing this. It's this, how do we improve communication, how do we motivate, and how do we drive the organization forward through being data-driven and through numbers that are consistent and understood throughout the organization. So it's a really fascinating topic and one that gets very, very little thrift from the industry in general. But we're here to address that today, which is the good news. And so one of the things that I think is really, really interesting is this question around, and again, this is a narrative that's being built that organizations aren't data-driven. And one of the things I want to challenge today is that assumption, is that the case? And it starts with this statistic. So this is a number that I read. It was in a Harvard Business Review reasonably recently, and we've done some blogs and conversation around it, but it's really fascinating to me. 92% of data professionals, this is chief data officers and chief analytic officers, believe that their businesses are not data-driven. Now, I find this really, really fascinating because firstly, I'm here to really question that number. I don't honestly believe it to be true. I think that the reality is that organizations do consume data, that they are data-driven, but just not in the way we think that they are. And my challenge for this number starts with the broad assumption is, potentially 92% of the businesses don't use the tools that I, the data professional, have built but they use other things to get their data. And I think that's the heart of it. That's what I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about the challenges of this multiple consumption pattern versus the definitive you must use this dashboard pattern, and what that means for organizations. And really, when we think about it, everyone consumes data, but the patterns are changing. So let's scratch the surface on this statement and go and remembering that 92%. I've never been in a finance department where the financial people are not data driven. Everyone in finance cares about the number, they think about the number, they work with numbers daily. They are data driven. The same applies to sales. Sales have commission targets, they have sales targets, they are looking at inbound leads, they're looking at conversion rates. This conversation and this narrative happens in every sales organisation I've met, except for organisations that don't sell. The same I could say could apply to marketing. Marketing again is looking at lead conversion. Where do I get my leads from? What's the cost of leads? These are conversations that are driven by numbers, driven by data, and ultimately within themselves and that narrative are completely numbers driven. What may not be happening is that collectively as an organisation is that we're having a conversation about the numbers and what they mean end to end. And I think that's really what one of the core differences that we're talking about today. When people say we're not data driven, I think it's the sense is that we're not using the same set of numbers. We're not using this end-to-end understanding of how the numbers link together. Rather, we're having very siloed conversations. And I think that's interesting, and I think that is probably the true reality, is that data consumption today is entirely siloed. And ultimately, these patterns about how we can consume data and how we think about data and the tools that we use for data is really, really changing. Again, thinking about, any team in the organization, we know from the marketing team, you see people using Excel, you see people using in-app reporting, you see people using Google Analytics, you see people using paper-based reports. You're seeing people using this plethora of styles. And a lot of it is being driven by the fundamental changes that are happening in organizations today. But when we think about it, and we think about the context of this organization, this conversation, I want to sort of firstly start with a bit of a definition when we talk about consumption. So this industry, the analytics industry, is very good at talking about the 5% of people who create content, the data analysts in the organization who analyze data, who create reports, who push those reports out to the business. What we're talking about today is the 95% of people who consume data. These are the people that are having to get data from a variety of sources and use that data to do their jobs well. Now, the fundamental assumption we have of this 95% is that they are all motivated to do their jobs well. They all understand that they need data, they need intelligence, they need narrative and context to be able to do that, and they all search to hunger for that data. And those are the people we're talking about today. Because as we flow through that, you'll see the context and meaning of that and why this consumer is so much more important than the analyst. It's not just because they're not analysing data, but because fundamentally they are the ones that take the data and turn that data into meaningful outcomes for the organisation. We should care more about them because they're the ones that drive organisational performance. So the reality is, since I started being an analyst back in the day, and it was a long time ago, too long ago for most of you probably, but the reality is, we're seeing so much more data today than we did in the past, and that, that's kind of it's a norm. We understand it. We know that there's more data. We know that there's a ton more data sources. We're seeing so many more delivery mechanisms from paper to Excel to mobile to desktop. But one of the things that we're really seeing coming back into the fore now is the whole governance. The fact that decentralization of analytics was a real trend for the last 10 or 15 years, and we're seeing that now being pulled right back for a whole host of reasons, be that regulatory or just simply control and getting people on the same page. But what we're seeing again consistently across all organizations is that everyone has a desire to be data-driven and getting their hands around, well, what does that really mean for me as an organization? How do I make my people data-driven, etc.? And what are the challenges I have for that? And addressing these consumption patterns in that need and how people become data-driven for that. So, what we think of historically is these changes from content and consumption. We tend to think of it as linear. So again, when I started work, there was a lot of paper-based reports. We generated reports pretty much daily. They got sent to branches for branch managers, and they would be able to understand the performance of all their salespeople on a daily basis and react to that. What occurred after that is that we sort of migrated from paper to starting to present data in Excel and send out Excel spreadsheets to people via Lotus Notes, again giving away my age. And again, you're providing people with another form of pretty much the same content. And then we moved into online reports where we started with our intranet environment. And then lastly, we built our dashboard program to deliver dashboards to the organization. Now, the reality is that the types of methodologies of consumption is linear. They were created over time and new ones were created over time. But the reality is the consumption pattern wasn't. The consumption pattern was additive. What we found, and we look at any organization today, you don't see an organization that simply uses dashboards in isolation of everything else. People still walk into meetings with printed pieces of paper. They use Excel spreadsheets because the finance department loves using them, loves creating their models in Excel and sending those out. They still use reports from either inline applications such as Google Analytics or Marketo, or their own reporting engines, or they use dashboards that are built where, again, whether they're operational or they are enterprise-wide with a whole lot of data. And the reality is today people use multiple methods of consumption. There is no single way that you consume data in your organization. And we're the same here at Yellowfin. We see virtually every type and means that people can consume data being consumed. And we're no different to anybody else. And I think fundamentally that is the challenge. This consumption model that we have becomes the core challenge that organizations are facing. This is what's creating the governance headache. This is what's creating this sense of, not everyone's on the same page. And that's the fundamental issue we need to address. And that's what we're talking about today. So why do we have all these different methods? What happens? What's it created from? So on the first sense, there's this real, one of the things I learned really early on is that there's this wide spectrum of use cases. From the very, very basic, which says, I can essentially write a number on a piece of paper and give it to you and go, there, that's what we did this month, or a telephone call that says that, all the way through to something that's really advanced analytics on the other end, where someone's building models, propensity models, trying to understand the likelihood of default on a loan, all those sorts of things. And the reality is the consumption, how people consume it, again, this is the 5% creating this analysis. These 5% tend to work in the tools that they love best. So, without being too stereotypical, the finance teams loves Excel, so they'll work in Excel, they'll produce content in Excel, and therefore, by default, they send Excel spreadsheets to the business for consumption. The business never asked for Excel as a consumption tool. They were given it to them by the analyst that created it. And it's the same with data models. Advanced data models, they're built out, and what you will get is you'll get a printout from R, you'll get some kind of output that's generated by the tools that we used to create the content in the first place by the analysts. And because no one in this space is thinking about the consumer, ultimately what the analyst is doing is giving probably not the most ideal content to the end user. The end user then responds to this by looking for other ways to consume this data and to share this data. And so you end up with this multiplier effect of content and content delivery mechanisms, because I have to, as a business manager, get something in Excel. Now I've got to turn that into something I can meaningfully take into my business and tell my direct reports about. So I will take those numbers, rearrange them, shape them, and create a narrative around them and send them on. And that's where we get this huge diversity of models and driven by these use cases, and ultimately driven because the tools that created the numbers in the first place were analyst-driven, not consumption-driven. And so a really good example of that is the news. If we think about how people consume news and the challenges that represents, across organizations, we see many ways, generally across news, we see many ways to get news. I can get gossip from my next door neighbor. He can tell me exactly what's been going on in the street. He's been sort of watching the neighbors and knows exactly what's going on. I get news from my co-workers. I get news from Facebook. I get online newspapers, LinkedIn, TV news, aggregate providers. And from all of these, ultimately, I don't know the source, right? I just, fundamentally, it's a form of hearsay. I'm just getting content from these providers, and I have to make a judgment call about whether to believe it or not, what its value is to me, and I'll take that and I'll meld it together and create my own narrative and own understanding about what's happening in the world from all these different sources. And when we think about sort of the political context around fake news, etc., this is fundamentally sort of one of the I suppose the problems that are created from this plethora is that we've got all these different sources, very little validity to any of them in particular, but yet we're asked to make decisions and we're asked to vote and think about the future of our world based upon this. And so it's very complex, it's difficult, and we tend to fall into very broad narratives around that rather than being specific. And that's a big challenge. And that, I think, is the same challenge when we apply that same thinking to organisations today. When you see all these different data sources and you have different ways of getting them from your co-workers and from online tools, etc., how do you make sense of that as a business person? How do you take all of these different tool sets and make sense of it? And ultimately, that's what people want. Business users fundamentally want curated data. And they want this because they want to be able to do their jobs well. They want to be able to trust the data so that they can move forward. One of the biggest challenges, and a great statistic I read recently again, that sort of really underlies this, is that CEOs, 84% of CEOs fundamentally don't trust the data that they use to make decisions. And it goes back to this plethora model, right? You're getting so many different variations of the truth. What do I need to know? And ultimately, I want it to be curated. I want the data to be relevant. I want it to be accurate. I want it to be timely when I need it. And I want to be able to act on it. And the reality is, for a user, you don't want to miss something important that's going to help you to do your job. You want your data that you need to be easy and convenient to consume. You want to understand the meaning of that data. So sometimes a simple number makes complete sense to you, but other times you need a big narrative. You need to understand what that number is, why it's important, what you need to do about it. And lastly, it's that how to take action on data. And interestingly, in today's world, we want it to be pretty as well. So there's a huge requirement when we think about commuting with data and what that means. There's a lot of needs that need to be met when we're thinking about all these different delivery mechanisms to help people to get the numbers that they trust to be able to act on. And so there's a number of key tech drivers that are creating new options, and thinking about that. And so what is driving these multiple consumption patterns and different ways in it? And the first one is delivery. So convenience and ease of use of consumption drives consumption mediums. And so a good example of that is, again, if I print off a piece of paper, if I've got a report and I print that off and I walk into a meeting with it, I've turned it into paper because it's convenient for the point in time that it makes sense. For the finance team who love working in Excel, that's a convenient form of dealing with the data that they have in place. They can manipulate it, they can build models, they can put what ifs in it, etc., etc. And so the delivery is very much tailored to the ease of consumption. And we've seen this shift over time from paper-based to desktop-based to ultimately to web-based and now to mobile. And these are all delivery mechanisms that are really driving the ease of consumption discussion. So you get this multiple tone depending upon what the user is trying to achieve at that point in time, what delivery mechanism makes the most sense for them. The second one is timeliness. And I find this to be really fascinating because, again, I think it changes the way in which people are prepared to access data and how much time they're there to think about it. So the urgency of knowing, if I need to know something, then that's going to drive my decisions around the data. So, or the lack of it. So if something's not important or it's not urgent, then I'm prepared to have it delivered in a different way. So, and I'll take, for example, a really simple example of this, the weather. So it's the first thing in the morning when I wake up, I want to have quick, easy access to the weather. I have a weather app. I can quickly open it up. It just tells me what the weather is going to be for that day. It doesn't tell me necessarily the 24-day outlook because the reality is I'm just choosing what I need to do in regard to getting dressed that day. And that's the timeliness option. So the app is very specific. It's today, it's the weather today, what time will it rain, how do I get dressed, what do I need to do? Now, for other types of news, that's not as important. So if I'm prepared to read, something about, baking bread in Norway as a good example, then I'm prepared to pick up a weekend magazine, spend some time over a coffee and really think about that and read that in detail. I'm going to want to see pictures. I want to see a lot of narrative here. I want to have a different form of conversation with the narrative than I do necessarily with the weather. They both tell me something, but the urgency and the need to know changes the way it gets delivered and the way I think I want to consume it. And the last one is required action. So again, if I need to act on data versus explore data, or I need to tell someone about the data, then these are very different ways in which people will consume it. So if I need to act it, I might have an application that is designed specifically for me to act on that. So, I could have analytics built into my operational system that will tell me, here are the 24 people you should call today because they are most likely to want to take out a loan based on their actions. So I'm going to react to that. I'm going to deal with that right now. On the other hand, I may need to explore data. So I'm going to want to use an analytical dashboard where I can take the time to really understand the trends. I want to be able to slice and dice my data, and I want to think about, what the meaningful trends in my business are. And again, so the tool set I'll use for that and the consumption I'll use for that is a form of a tool set that allows me to analyze that data in that way and to consume the data in that way. And then the last is, when do you need to tell? And so again, coming back to that communication model of data, the reality is we're going to put data into corporate reports, into annual reports, into board reports, into presentations, into monthly meetings, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we will use data differently and we will create content to help us to get the best outcomes for that. And it's these three things, it's the changes of delivery mechanisms in terms of the technology, the timeliness required, the required action that is creating these drivers for different patterns of consumption. And the implication of this, and this goes back to this news problem, is that we've got lots of different tools, lots of methods, but today little or no governance. There is no one source of truth in organisations today. And this is at the heart of the consumption problem. Getting everyone to use the same dashboard, the same tool to get the numbers is not the answer, because consumption patterns aren't driven by that. People will always go to what's easy. The reality is we need to tackle the root cause, and the root cause is truth. And that's where it lies, is it creates the big problem, is that every number is different, that without truth, when we walk into a meeting and I've got my paper report, or I've got my spreadsheet, or I've got another report from someone else, I don't have necessarily, I think this is where the challenge in organisations is that people do not have the same number. Salesperson will have a different number of revenue compared to the finance person, compared to the marketing person, et cetera, et cetera. This is where data-driven decision-making falls down, because all of a sudden we fall onto opinions about who's right and wrong. We don't trust and believe in the number. We don't use that common number to make decisions. So going back to news as an example, something's happened. So again, we've got this an event has happened. We've got all these media, different ways of doing that. But if we take a step back and we accept the fact there are all these different channels. We accept that channels are there and will always be there, and there will always be new channels being created. But within those channels, we create a layer which is called the facts. This is the centralized repository of organizational data where everyone goes to get the facts. If I want to know how much we sold last month of blue shoes in France, then I go to one place and I can print that out on a paper report. I can push that into my Excel spreadsheets. I can have that in my web reports, my dashboards, my signals, my monthly report, my presentations. If we all access the facts, then the way in which we consume it and the interpretation of that data and what it means to the organization, what we need to do, that can be different. But the reality is then we're having a conversation around strategy and tactics. We're not having a conversation around the number. And this is why data consumption is so important. We need to create an environment where people can rely on the facts and use those facts in any way they like to move the business forward and to increase organisational performance. And going forward, I think when we sort of think about all those different ways of consumption, they're going to form into 3 different modes moving forward. You're going to have the feed. This is going to be your timeliness thing. This is the real time, as it happens, changes that exist today. And that's going to be where you're going to react to things very quickly. The second model, and this is the model that most people sort of know today when they think about analytics, is the analytical app model. This is your dashboards that you use. This could be your spreadsheets that are built, your models in Excel, etc. These are sort of formalized analytical processes that people rely on. And that's what most people today think about in terms of analysis. And the third one is going to be governed comms. I think the reality is organizations are going to have to put controls around how people access the narrative. What do we need to do based upon these numbers? How do we need to react based on these numbers? And that'll be your long form narratives, your presentations, etc. Those are ultimately, irrespective of the tools and the devices, etc. that you use, I think you'll find them falling into these 3 categories. So how does that look for the average person on the street, the average person working in an operational use case? Well, from a feed perspective, they might wake up in the morning and on their way to work from their mobile app, they'll start looking at signals, what's happening in my organization, how do I take action on those? There's been 24 leads just being generated and I'm going to start to react to that immediately. And they may consumer management updates. So something that was created yesterday say, hey, there's been a new marketing campaign that's come out that's going to impact leads, please react to this quickly. That's the feed. That's the stuff I need to react to immediately. The analytical applications, I'm going to be working in process. I'm going to be approving loan applications. And within that loan application, I'm going to see data-driven content. So I'm going to see reports and analysis about the applicant, and I'm going to be able to use that to make better decisions about whether to approve that loan or not. And then lastly, I'm going to look at a weekly summary dashboard. How am I tracking for my commissions? Am I on target? Am I getting the numbers I need? And then from a government comms perspective, I'm going to access monthly sales stories from my manager, and I'm going to get the quarterly business reviews that comes down from the CEO of the leadership team that's telling me what's happening in the business, telling me about the strategy, telling me where we're going. So I understand how my performance dovetails into that. And the numbers that are used across all of these are going to be identical. This is still going to be using the truth to deliver content across all of these. From a manager's perspective, the same thing. They've got the feed, they've got the apps, they've got the comms. They're going to be using signals to understand how their people are performing as they're performing. So, immediately when they see a drop-off in performance, they can react to that. So imagine the call center in this example. If people are meant to be doing 100 calls a day and all of a sudden there's some people dropping off and doing 50, I can react to that immediately. I don't have to go and find a report to tell me that. I want to deal with that automated and now. I'm going to add some of these signals to my weekly story. So I'm going to take something that's interesting and go, did we see this drop off or this increase? I'm going to add that to my story, and I want to jump to root cause analysis. What happened? Why did it happen? Who was it? What do I need to react to? The feed is going to help me to be much more effective in operationally running the business I'm in. From an analytical apps perspective, I'm going to use an embedded operational dashboard. Now that could be in Salesforce, it could be in my CRM systems, in my sales systems, et cetera, and it's going to help me again to operationally run the business. I'll be able to use that data to create sales objectives, and I can share those reports with my team. And from a government comms, I'm going to be creating monthly stories. I'm going to be generating stories that I want to feed down to my direct reports, and I want to share stories with the executive team and direct reports. I want to understand what's going across the organization, and I want to be ahead of the game there. I want to start planning ahead. And again, all of these tools are ultimately using the fundamental same data that keeps us all aligned. When I'm looking at sales numbers, those sales numbers that I'm feeding up to the exec team are identical to ones that I'm talking to with my direct reports. And then for the executive use case, the feed is the stories. It's a little bit higher level up. It's less day-to-day ops, but it is what's happening in each of my departments that report into me. I get a sense of it. I get to see their trends. I can highlight some signals potentially that's needing analysis. There's been a downward trend in sales in particular departments, so why is that happening? And I can share comments with my leadership team. So I can talk to the rest of the team and go, hey, did you see this? This is really, really interesting. Instead of using an embedded dashboard like my manager might be doing, I could be using an enterprise dashboard via a desktop, from the browser. And again, I can request further insights on key trends. And so I'm seeing a much broader based view, lots more data, but I'm seeing that condensed and aggregated in something I can consume. And then lastly, with governed comms, I'm going to be consuming those monthly management stories, but I'm going to be creating my quarterly board presentation. And again, I'm doing all of this with the same sets of numbers that, that will ripple up from the operational level all the way through to the strategic. And when we're all aligned on the numbers, all aligned on the truth, irrespective of the consumption tools I'm using, irrespective of the tools that I'm using to tell my story, we all are using the same numbers to build our communications, to talk about the business moving forward. And so ultimately, from my perspective, I really do believe the future is data-driven. Organizations are and will be data-driven. The real challenge is to harness that power and to create that one level of truth across the organization. So as a result of that, I'd say let's stop thinking about analysis as the only thing that happens in data, and let's focus far more on consumption. Let's get an organization completely aligned to the numbers, aligned to the one version of the truth, and spend our time and emphasis there so that people can use any form of consumption that makes sense for them, ones that are meaningful to them, that are convenient to them. But as long as everyone's telling exactly the same story with the same numbers and are aligned to the business strategy, I think that we will achieve our outcome that we need. Not everyone needs to use the exact same dashboard to move forward. So those are my thoughts and things for today. Really appreciate your time, and would love to take some questions if you have some chance. Okay, so we do have a few questions here. So how does today's consumption fit into the models? Look, I talked about it before, but think about the feed. I think the feed is one of the ones that are really new. The closest you'll get to that is probably email, so where you have alerts that are being generated via your BI system that are being emailed to you or coming out of your operational systems. Your email is the feed, and I think we'll see that being more formalized. I think we'll see tools moving forward that aggregate multiple BI vendors and create a feed that people react to immediately. I think when we're looking at the sort of the apps world, as I said, I touched on that, today we see within that, I will class a spreadsheet as an analytical application. I will class a dashboard that's being built, a Tableau report, a Power BI. They all fit into that space. And the one that I think is sort of, governed comms. I think we have comms today. We have presentations today. We have documents today. But I think you'll see them change. I think you will see more governance being put into those types of delivery methods just because of how really fundamentally important they are to organizations. And so I think you'll see those kind of sort of come into the whole realm of thinking about consumption patterns. Hope that helps. And we think, so next question, are there any consumption patterns that we see disappearing? So look, I think we see paper on the wane, and it really depends again, that convenience model. I think one that everyone wants to see go is the Excel spreadsheet, but that's probably pretty unlikely. I think that you're always, because you've still, at some level, the people who create the content are going to be the ones that kind of generate the consumption models. And so I think Excel, for all of its foibles, is just very good for certain classes of content creation, for financial models, etc. I think they'll be continued to use, and therefore we'll continue to see more of an additive approach. We'll see more and more types of consumption rather than less. What role will mobile play versus desktop? Look, I sort of vaguely touched on it. I think mobile is very much is a delivery mechanism. It's a new form that people can create and view content. But it dovetails into that convenience. So you're not going to see people trying to really analyze dashboards and consume very heavy reports via a mobile device. It just doesn't make sense. But if I'm getting signals, if I'm getting things that are, sales are up 25% in blue shoes in France, well, that's something I consume on a phone. And so I think you'll see the mobile being very much tailored to what we call snacking. It's this a quick ability to view something quickly, but if you're going to take a really long time to view and analyze, then you're going to use a desktop environment, whether it be a browser, etc., to do that. And so I think, again, mobile is a really good example of a new delivery device versus a replacement of anything else there. It's another one of those additive models that exist. Yeah, so another question here. So where does automated analysis fit into this? So it's a good question. Automated analysis is, I think, is sort of one of those fundamental shifts in BI today where we're moving from very much a manual process of analysing and trying to find stuff in data to being able to have tools that automatically surface that. And what I think that this automation will do, it will actually be the driver of the feed, because it's going to find things that people need to react to much, much faster than a data analyst can do. And because of its timeliness model, its ability to create and to find changes as they happen, I think you'll find that really being feed driven ultimately. I think it may sort of lead to people asking bigger questions, which sort of feeds back in the data analyst mode. But I see it as being sort of really a feed-centric model that'll happen. So do we think, as a result of that, do we think that decisions will be automated? That's a really good question. I think the reality, people who are building software today and putting AI into software are looking at different tool sets and different models to be able to automate as many decisions as possible. There are a vast range of things that today are completely automated, and that automated fundamentally means that decisions are being made by machines, not people. And so, yes, I think they are. I think there's a lot of decisions that are made today using data that are done manually that will shift into applications that will be completely automated end to end. But the result of that is that people will, I think, spend more time on more complex, more creative, more human-centric decision-making processes than the robotic type ones. But that's a huge conversation in of its own. So that's really all we've got time for today. Really appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate everyone coming on board. And if you've got any further questions, if you want to understand more about what Yellowfin does and how we think about consumption, we've got some great tool sets in this space. Would love to really hear from you. So feel free to visit us at yellowfinbi.com and contact us if you've got any more questions. Thank you very much.